Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
A Geek for Fun.
And Steve Baxey.
Oh my god. What? Steve Baxey's here? I don't
know,
think
right?
he's done a normal introduction in a long ass time.
Yeah, it's kind of
You
boring,
see,
you know.
He picked it this time, so he has to play it straight.
Yeah, that's fair, So we're
Never
here
stopped
today
in the past.
to review what movie, Mr. Steve Baxey?
Alright, today we are reviewing David Fincher's latest movie based on the comic of the same name from last year, The Killer, starring Michael Fassbender.
Interesting. I remember you telling me it's based on a comic, but every time you talk about this movie, I always forget that detail. So that's kind of cool. You've mentioned this movie to me like several times. You're like, oh, you should so watch it. And I'm like, just fucking pick it. We do a show where we talk about stuff all the time, and people are always like, oh, I don't know what to pick. Oh, let me think here. So just fucking pick it. And so Steve took my advice and he fucking picked it. And I don't know, it was an interesting time. It was funny to talk about because Steve was like, I don't know, my track record with these isn't great. Ian doesn't like his films the same way I do. So there's a lot of trepidation. I will say it's not like gonna be on my top favorite movies of all time. We'll see how the review goes, because tend to be what happens is when you don't have a lot of love or hate for something, it's just a lot easier to talk about the negatives. So if I do that, I'm sorry, but I didn't hate this movie by any stretch of the imagination. There were even some moments I quite liked. There are also some moments where I'm like, yeah, this is just a little bit boring. So we'll see how this goes. So there's my general thoughts. Is I'm not like, I don't want to say mixed, but I have a variety of opinions on this movie. How about you, Alfie? What do you think of this?
I think you used a good word there, because it is boring. It's hard to talk about because you say that and people immediately oh, so this film isn't worth watching or anything, right? But when the movie is about boredom, it's kind of is that a fault when it makes it have that kind of pace, when it does make it go in those methodical and it's David Fincher, who's so detail precision. So I don't think calling it boring, I think that's a good way to kind of tell people what they're getting in for, but I don't think that can be fair to call it a flaw of the movie, because it's very intentionally about how this guy sees the world and what the world is that he lives with, and it's presenting something which is normally treated with a lot of fanfare, a lot of the closest thing this reminds me of is the John Wick films, particularly the first one or the second one, where we start to expand the world a little bit more. But it's if you took all the I forget the quote, but it's film is life with all the boring parts taken out. Is if that is this movie with all the boring parts taken out, this movie is all the exciting parts of that taken out, because it wants to show you what it's like with the preparation. It wants to show you like every single, this is what you have to do to get this done, but at the same time not living by that, because it's also a character piece where like every time you think he's got one of these things sorted, something goes like pretty like miserably wrong, and there's like humor in that, but there's also some character work in that I picked up. I didn't finish this that long ago, and I think it's something that Steve's probably sat with this film a lot longer, and he's read the book and stuff, so I'm sure there's like more I'm missing there, but that's just what I gathered from the first viewing, and I like that choice. I just know immediately from these choices that this isn't something I think you can just recommend to everyone, because I think just some people are just not gonna want to sit with what the film is doing. It almost reminds me a little of like Batman Begins in that sense, where Batman Begins gets very like negatively compared to The Dark Knight sometimes because it's so focused on like the minutia and how that informs Bruce's character, and like this is how he did this and this is how this goes this to this, and just kind of the fun of putting that on film. I like that kind of stuff. This doesn't do that in the same extent for me, but that's why this is interesting to me, because I like seeing that kind of process. I like having that kind of one-on-one dynamic with a main character. Like, I think Fassbender does a really good job, especially with the narration, of like keeping you through it without needing that many other cast members like throughout. You just get like certain scenes with good actors. So all of that, I think, is just a long-winded way of me saying I liked it, but I think it's something that's a very specific film for a very specific type of enjoyment, and you got to be in kind of the right mood for it.
And Steve,
Yeah,
what's your vibe?
I think Alfie kind of nails the fact that you do have to be in a certain headspace for this. I saw this movie when it had its very limited theater run, because Netflix is bullshit, and they'll release a movie that could make $100 million in like 2 theaters for a day, and then just dump it on streaming so no one ever sees it again. So that's what happened to this movie, where it came out for like a weekend and then immediately got dumped on Netflix and no one ever talked about it again, which made me very sad. But I'm a really big David Fincher fan, and 2023 was a good year for like these kinds of movies, because if you like David Fincher, chances are you also like people like Michael Mann, or Christopher Nolan, and like all of those guys make very similar kinds of movies, and all 3 of them had new movies come out the same year. So it was kind of like the ultimate year for like grungy dad movies from the 80s and 90s. So I love David Fincher. He's one of my favorite directors. He's really interesting in how methodical he is, in a way that I feel like people kind of make fun of without sort of appreciating what he's trying to go for. Sometimes people accuse him of being like, the reason he takes so many shots is because he doesn't know what he's looking for, and that's not true as far as I can tell. A lot of it is sort of like having options, but then a lot of the other parts of it is just like you have to deal with the production and the nature and weather and stuff that alters what you're trying to do. He knows exactly what he's looking for. It's just a matter of like nailing it. But I really like this movie. This is one of my favorite movies from last year. I think this is a great movie, and I feel like it's got super underrated in the Fincher space, because David Fincher is really famous for like 2 or 3 movies that everyone thinks are incredible or perfect. And then he's made like a slew of other movies that people talk about as like, oh, that's okay, but it's not as good as like Zodiac, or it's not as good as Seven, or it's not as good as Social Network, or something like that. And this movie, when it came out, got positive reviews, but a lot of people were watching it and just saying like, yeah, this is fine. This is just like a lesser David Fincher movie. And I don't know what movie those people watched, because I feel like this is the ultimate David Fincher movie. This entire movie is David Fincher making a movie about what it's like to be David Fincher. It has very little to do with being a hitman, and it has everything to do with how perfectionism is essentially just a trap and you're full of shit. What I really love about this is that it's entirely a bait and switch kind of concept, where the movie starts with like this really clean 30-second animated intro where everything is timed really beautifully, and you have all these slick shots, and you look at like the gun from a sexy angle, and like legit it's just like the opening to John Wick 2 with the way it looks. And then it's just 20 minutes of Michael Fassbender sitting alone in a room doing nothing. And the thing I love about it is I feel like the sort of dry humor of that kind of stuff gets lost on people because the idea is that it's supposed to be a bait and switch. And so when you cut from that to him just like sitting there doing yoga on the floor, part of that is really funny. But then he also like opens the line talking about like quoting Popeye the Sailor Man and shit. Like, this is not a serious human being by any stretch of the imagination. And at the end of the day, the movie is just about how he has this mantra, he has this philosophy, he's this perfectionist, but everything he's saying is wrong. Every word out of his mouth is just absolute bullshit. He talks constantly in this mantra about like how don't make it personal, it's all about the money. And the entire movie is him just not listening to his own advice, and he keeps repeating it to himself. He says things like, I'm not political," and then listens to the Smiths for the entire movie. And he's so on the nose about it that, like, when his girlfriend gets in a coma, the song literally goes, "My girlfriend's in a coma." And it's so funny, like, how unaware this dude is, to the point where the movie ends with him saying, like, "I'm just like you," he says in his multi-million-dollar beach house in South America. He's just like us. So I really like this movie. I feel like it's something that you kind of have to shift gears for pretty quickly, because it's not a crime thriller in the same way something like Seven is. It's not an action thriller in the same way something like John Wick is. It's not even really a hitman movie. At the end of the day, it's a movie about a guy who happens to be a hitman, where in reality it's just about the humorous side of David Fincher as a director and his perfectionism. If heist movies are like metaphors for filmmaking, then this is a metaphor for what it's like for a director to be as detail-oriented as David Fincher is, and how much that blows up in your face trying to do it.
That's a really interesting interpretation that I just don't think occurred to me on any level as I was watching the film. Like, I just did not really get that, because I don't really pay too much attention to David Fincher's work. I feel like we reviewed Zodiac on the show recently-ish. If nothing else, I know I rewatched Zodiac.
Yeah.
I know I rewatched Zodiac at some point within like the last year or so. And like, I always forget Seven is a movie that exists until someone brings it up. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, David Fincher is kind of known for being a perfectionist. That is a really good, like, just summation of the man from what I've like come to gather about his career. Not that I've followed it too closely or anything, but you know, you like hear stories and interviews and stuff, and it always gets brought up. So that's a really cool interpretation of the film. For me, I think the thing that like kind of just became a negative overall was not that it wasn't interesting seeing him do all the prep work and all the like, you know, stuff that goes into committing a murder and getting away with it. For me, the thing that just like kind of made the movie feel imbalanced is they'd show you all that, but then you'd have something like actually cool happen, and I'd be like more interested in just that going on, and then we'd go back to the, you know, more boring stuff. And I feel like with this, you know, Alfie, you made that point earlier of, well, this is the movie without the boring parts cut out. This is the movie that is exclusively the boring parts. Well, not the fucking fight in the dude's house. That was actually fundamentally interesting. And, like, that dude, when he fucking, like, comes running at Michael Fassbender, and then it just cuts, and you see Fassbender just get, like, thrown across a hallway into a wall. I was like, yes, let's go. That was the highlight of the movie for me. And it was kind of interesting to go from that and then to have things slow way down again as we look for the second culprit in all of this. And again, it's not that stuff wasn't interesting. Was that Tilda Swinton or was that someone else playing that?
Yeah, it was.
Okay,
yeah.
I thought so, yeah. It's not that it wasn't interesting, it's not that her performance wasn't good, and, you know, Tilda Swinton telling a joke about a bear fucking a guy is, like you said, Steve, kind of in line with just the that's a little fucking ridiculous, that's silly, kind of moments that this movie has. But at the same time, it's just such a long scene after such like a really blood pumping moment. It's kind of funny that, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. This may very well be intentional. The more I'm thinking about it as I'm talking about it, it's kind of funny that like when he's doing all the boring stuff is when he's got this heart rate monitor on and he's checking it and trying to make sure that his heart rate doesn't go up too much, that he doesn't get too excited. But then when he goes to do the cool big fight exciting moment in the movie is when he takes the fucking heart rate monitor off. So I don't know. And maybe it's all certainly intentional and it's all like very well thought out and everything, don't get me wrong, but it's just like a long drawn out thing, and I think that the movie may have been a little more true to the experience of being all the boring parts if like he took the fucking heart rate monitor off and then the next time then we just get one of those like big dramatic cuts and then he's just as fucked up as we see him for the rest of the movie, getting back in the car and like driving away with the fucking house on fire or something. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. Go ahead.
I get what you're saying, Ian. I think that's like something that as well. I think is something that might be against the movie's detriment, because what I think they're going for and what I like with those aspects is I like the idea that if you are, and like athletes talk about this as well, but if you're like someone at the top of their field like that, often what you're preparing for are those very short, momentary action parts. Like, you spend like 24 hours for like 3 seconds it will take for you to shoot someone, and then like the excitement of that and how that kind of spirals and everything that you do get something that's a little more intense, a little bit more like the score kind of kicks in a little bit more, or the camera starts moving in more interesting ways. Like after he's had this big preparation, low build, and then boom, 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 fight, short release, and then go. The action scene where we fight the guy is like really well done, and it's really, really frenetic, and it's just like this kind of fumbling, like grab anything you can and just smack it on this dude's head and just will not go down until you have to finally pop some slugs into him. And then at the end, you still got to deal with the fucking dog that comes out like a bat of hell. It's just like, so like, I get all of that, and then you don't have anything else to follow that up, can definitely lead, like, you want to, okay, so like, is that the most exciting part of the movie? I definitely think that's intentional. I definitely think that's an aspect of like wanting to go for a more low-key ending, want to go for something that is a little bit more like, this is how these things get resolved, or this is how, after you've made the big exciting like thrill of the movie, you'll say, this is going off Steve's analogy of like this being about David Fincher, that's like the final paycheck with the studio executive at the end, it's like, all right, I got my fucking, here's your movie, now don't call me again. if I had to imagine, maybe that's what that's coming on, but I don't think that makes for the most exciting viewing experience in the world. And I have seen the thing that I think holds it against it is when you show that you can do that really effectively, and then when you choose to spend a lot of time on things that, although you've done really good, I've played the Hitman games before, I've watched a lot of these type of movies, like, a lot of this isn't new to me. A lot of this is stuff I've already seen done before or seen focused on in small increments. It's certainly the most I've ever seen them all put together in one place, but I don't think it's something that the novelty of that alone can only take you so far. So I don't blame anyone for being like, I kind of would have liked to see like 2 or 3 more of that cool fight scene you shot, because you were really good at shooting that fight scene, But that would be a very different movie, So it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges.
It's interesting. It's interesting to talk about like all the setup and everything that goes into it, because there's like this hypocritical detachment that he talks about, and Steve, you mentioned that. And the thing I found the most interesting, like kind of coming away from the film, is all of the people that he kills in the movie are the least responsible for what has happened to him. And then when he has the chance to get the guy who is the most responsible, he just lets him be.
Yes, no, 100%. I mean, that's the sort of thing about it is, I don't think you should approach this movie from the perspective of, here are the minutiae of a very good, efficient hitman. Because I think at the end of the day, what the movie's about is not the mundane sides of being a hitman. It's that this guy is actually really bad at his job. The reason all of this goes the way it does and he makes the choices he does is because he's actually just bad at his job. The fight scene, for example, right? Like, I love that fight scene. It's my favorite fight scene of any movie from last year. I think it's incredibly well shot. But the way that fight scene goes, and the way most of the kills in the movies goes, is they're always preceded by his little narration of stick to the plan, anticipate, don't improvise, etc. And the reason he takes his heart monitor off is because he's not sticking to the plan. And it's so much so that he's going against his mantra that they don't even let him finish saying it before the fight gets started, because he's full of shit, that he's doing this the wrong way. And so that entire action sequence is him literally just walking into a situation and fucking it up in a way that he shouldn't have to do, based on what he's talking about the entire movie. And you're right, he does go through these stages of like going through and killing the people responsible, up until he gets to the guy who's actually responsible and then chooses not to kill him. Because at the end of the day, he's just a hypocrite, and that his way of doing things does not actually work. The movie is playing on that whole aesthetic of, this is an ideal, efficient killer who's great at his job and is completely unstoppable and always gets his man or whatever. But I mean, ultimately, he just either gets really lucky, or he just fucks up beyond recognition and walks away clean. And I think that's part of the fun of it. And like that fight scene, the reason it works as well as it does is it's thrilling and it gets you off guard, because it is that one moment in the movie that breaks it. But the reason I think you go from that to the Tilda Swinton thing is you're going from a situation where, if he was actually listening to his own advice, the fight scene would not have gone the way it did. And then you go to the Tilda Swinton thing, and he has every opportunity to kill her instead of just going to talk to her, and he still fucks that bit up. And then the joke she tells him about the bear, I think kind of at the end of the day, is just the moral of the whole story, or what he's doing. He's the hunter going after the bear. He's the guy who's just constantly walking into situations where he's just going to get fucked up. And he doesn't seem to understand that he keeps doing this to himself. And like, it is a gritty, realistic version of a Looney Tunes cartoon at the end of the day. Like, think about this from the perspective of, like, imagine that this dude is Daffy Duck, because that's basically what's going on.
This kind of seems like a very separate topic, but it does kind of make me think about it, because as you describe it, it's much funnier than it is to actually watch it. So there's kind of like a discussion here of like, how well does a dry humor actually work for, you know, an individual, especially when you put it within the context of like a very dramatic story with like very visceral, violent imagery and stuff going on. I don't know. It's just, I don't know if that's a worthwhile discussion to have, or just something where I want to say it and then move on.
Yeah, my thing on that is, I feel like the issue you're gonna have is, because I think, like Ian said, it's like describing that, and the way you tell that story and the way you put emphasis on that story is funnier than it is. And I think this might be where it's a case of David Fincher not quite having the skill set for that in the same way to reach a wider thing, because the way this movie is funny is in like a like a chuckle like to yourself kind of funny. Like there's like and it does that joke a lot, like back and forth. And I think that's something that just isn't gonna hit or be enough to carry a lot of people through that. Because I think the premise and the joke is very on the nose, and outside of the humor, which I think is one of this film's weaker aspects, I do think you could have turned that up a bit more without needing, because you're already, Steve, like you're saying, like the song choices and stuff, right? I think it's trying to be a little too clever for its own good on that case, because I think it's going to hurt some of the things it could have got. It could have got funnier laughs. It could have got higher things if it actually did go a little harder with that. And I think that's just because David Fincher doesn't like doing that. He likes his dry, like chuckle to himself humor. I like dry humor myself, but I think just emphasis can make dry humor go from a chuckle to like a belly laughter. But aside from that, the thing that I really liked is you mentioned the bear story, which is where I got the most enjoyment from this film once it get to that and it had that lens. Because I really like it watching this through the interpretation that you're going through and saying like he's doing these things because he doesn't realize he's doing it to himself, and he doesn't realize it. My thing is he realizes exactly what he's doing to himself, and he actually is very competent, but he keeps trying to justify to himself that he's not that. But he clearly is extremely aware of like the for example, like the shooting incident right at the very start of the film. He's got so many clear shots of that guy. He's got so many clear boom, just pull the trigger, there he's gone. And he specifically waits until there's almost like a 50-50 chance that she could walk in front of him and get thing. And he's like, oh shit, you know, but it's that the thing that he has that lead up of talking about boredom beforehand. It's like, I'm gonna say this phrase and you're both gonna immediately get it and laugh, and like I kind of have to. Is this guy just reminds me kind of like Goku, you know? Where, yeah, the end of the world isn't something he wants, but if it just so happens that events spiral into where it's the end of the world, it's a hell of a lot more exciting for him, you know? So I got the interpretation that all of these mistakes he was making were like 80% intentional, because he liked he had, because they have a specific thing as well of he's never done this before. He's had this thing where this is a new thing for him. So the interpretation I got was like, he's kind of just done with this life. He's got more money than God could ever want, and he wants to see what would happen if you can fuck up. And I think that also informs a lot of the other characters' relationships to him, but they keep expecting him to act in a certain way, to act in a more, the Hodges scene, right? And this is the character that we've informed that knows him the longest, that has had the most interaction with him for since he was in school and stuff. And he's still like, why are you doing this? This isn't anything like you're doing. And it reads to me more kind of like a midlife crisis. Like he just wants to see what would happen if you, when you're in a car and you get that impetus of like, what if I just throw this out the window? What if I just open the door right now and just jump out, right? And this is him finally doing that. Like seeing how badly can I get away with fucking my life up to a small extent. And what I think is interesting is, in the grand scheme of things, he kind of got off really fucking lucky with what they did to his girlfriend and shit. Like the fact that she's still alive and able to sip martinis at the end and chill out is like, he really fucking like, in this world he lives in, got really, really lucky. So it feels to me less so like it was a personal, I've got to get back. Obviously, there's some aspect of that, right? You'd still be fucking ridiculous, infuriated and stuff, but for someone as cold and heartless as this guy is kind of unfeeling with a lot of things, it feels more to me that this is like, yes, I kind of knew they'd do this to this extent, so this was a safe choice for me, so now I can have a fun hunt that's a little different. That's something, and like again, he talks about at the opening of the movie, like, how long has it been since I drowned somewhere? And then he gets to do that to Hodges, basically. And it feels more so like he's kind of wanted this to happen, and now he gets to play out this fun. And when he's had enough of it, and he's like, all right, I'm kind of bored of this now too, just don't bother me anymore. It's game's over, and I'll leave you alone. And that's the most interesting thing for me with this movie, how I read it.
I think I see where you're coming from. I think the trouble with that interpretation is I think by thinking of it in those terms, you sort of lose the larger critique that David Fincher is trying to make. Because I don't think he wants you to feel sympathetic or necessarily interested or fascinated in the interior of this guy's life, because he wants to show how hollow the whole thing is. David Fincher had a TV show on Netflix for a little bit. I don't know why he keeps going back to Netflix, but it bothers the hell out of me. But he did Mindhunter on Netflix for a couple years. 2 seasons of that show before it eventually never got renewed and never officially got canceled, and it never completely went away. And it makes me very sad because Mindhunter was one of the best things Netflix ever did because David Fincher was involved. But Mindhunter is basically a true crime style serial killer TV show. It takes place in the late 1970s, and it's basically the start of the FBI interviewing different known serial killers and kind of coming through the path of what would become understanding that kind of pathology. And every episode is basically like the pair of FBI guys going and interviewing like a different real life serial killer played by an actor. And that show was really interesting because it did the sort of true crime thing that a lot of people like, but it did also factor in this really interesting critique of where exactly are these guys coming from such that they became serial killers, and where is the dissonance between the people catching them like the FBI and the crimes they committed. And the whole thing has kind of like this alien feel of like the two parties on the two sides of this, the killers and the cops, are so completely on different levels with each other that they can't really hope to connect. But the whole point of it is that they're trying to. And then at the same time, these two guys are completely off the playing field from the regular people that the serial killers are actually impacting. And like the slow realization of the bureaucracy being devoid of that humanity is kind of the point of that show by the end. And I think David Fincher is acutely aware of like what that kind of culture is like, about like the people who like look up to Rorschach and thinks he's the coolest character in Watchmen or the most right character or something. And he plays with that kind of interpretation of characters, the kinds of people that say like Travis Bickle from Taxi was right or something, when he does something like Mindhunter. And if that's too...
Hello?
He's trying to do that, except he's laying it on thick because he doesn't want you to kind of miss that. And the idea that this guy has no sort of interior life, that he is just a hypocrite, that he fucked up and he refuses to just accept the fact he fucked up, and then cascading into a series of much deeper fuck-ups while never actually stopping to interrogate what he's doing to make this worse is sort of the point. That because he completely lacks that self-awareness, he gets off at the end and gets to say, I'm just like everybody else, in the most hypocritical situation possible, where you've just seen him be the exact opposite of that the entire time. Not to mention the fact that he's with his hot girlfriend on the South American country in a mansion that he owns. He is not one of us, and he doesn't get that. And that's sort of where the sort of critique of the whole thing rests. And I think if you make that intentional and say he's just kind of looking for something to make his life more interesting, I think you would sort of miss that, because the fact that he's unable to admit the mistake itself is sort of the point on that level. The other thing about it, just real quick, too, that I think is really interesting is the kinds of jokes that are in this movie. They are the sort of like dry chuckle movies, but like, if you go back and rewatch it, some of the lines and some of the things he says are legitimately laugh out loud funny or just straight up ridiculous. Like when he says WWJWBD, what would John Wilkes Booth do? Like that's legitimately really funny. Or where he gets to New Orleans, and New Orleans, like he's like, New Orleans is a city of 1,000 restaurants with one menu. Like I think that's legitimately really funny dialogue. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just more inclined to that sort of humor. But I feel like there is sort of a level of this where like it is trying to be aptly ridiculous in certain respects, and it's lowering you into a false sense of security because you think you're watching this procedural, methodical killer, and everything out of his mouth is just horseshit the entire time, and it's ridiculous horseshit over and over and over again.
You know, you describe the humor in this, and it reminds me of another movie in a very similar vein, which I know you also love. But I like that movie quite a bit more than I like this one, and the humor in that movie especially so. And that's In Bruges.
Yeah, I love In Bruges. It's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, no, it's a great movie. It's like really, really fucking funny and fucked up. But like, I feel like you're trying to imply that the humor is on a similar like vein as that. And
That's actually a really good comparison. Sorry, just real quick. That's a really good comparison because I think these two are kind of the opposite sides of the same coin. In Bruges is a really funny movie that is a lot darker than you expect it to be when you realize what it's actually about. The Killer is a really dark movie that is actually much funnier than you think it is at first.
Okay. I mean, maybe. I don't know. Like, I feel like just the way you're describing the humor in this is just, like, it's trying to be, or it's in a similar vein to In Bruges, but I just think, like, the execution is just completely different. Because, you know, I've watched David Fincher movies, and maybe he just doesn't do comedy very well, or at least not well enough to my standards. So maybe it is just like a personal taste thing, or maybe it's just a failing on his part, because, like, you know, I like Zodiac. Zodiac's a pretty good movie. I like Seven, but I don't think either of those movies have, like, much humor in them. Is this the closest thing David Fincher has made to a comedy?
I don't think so. Mank is pretty funny. I like Mank more than most people do. Benjamin Button and Social Network both have, like, more comedic elements to them. It'd probably be in the same league as any of those. I think something like Zodiac or Seven or even like Fight Club are more of that sort of relentlessly dark crime thriller that he's sort of getting away from in these other movies.
Fight Club's got some pretty fucking funny lines, I'll give him.
It does, yeah, it does.
Haven't
I
been
don't think he's
fucked like
never
that
done
since
comedy.
kindergarten.
Yeah, his movies have a lot of levity to them, depending on where you look, but it's always kind of like a darker sense of humor. And this is just that turned up to 11, really.
I mean, I guess, again, like, the way you're describing the humor of this movie, I see what you're going for, but just that was not my experience. I don't think I laughed at any of the jokes that you're describing in the movie itself. And, you know, maybe that's on me. Maybe I'm not smart enough for Hitman comedy. But I don't know, it just didn't hit for me. Like, with the lens of the interpretation you're talking about, lines are coming back to me, and I'm like, huh. But just in the moment, it did not hit. Like what was the line about Florida and finding so many, like, hitmen live in Florida, apparently. Like, that one kind of, in retrospect, I think is a little bit funny. But just, again, not super wowed by any of it. Also, I'm not sure, like, what kind of a hired killer Tilda Swinton is. This is kind of neither here nor there, but I'm like, I really don't know, like, what she brings to the table and how she kills and why you would send her to go after another hitman. She just doesn't seem like the type that would be, you know, what's the word I want? Oh yeah, useful. In any real context.
I don't know. I feel like, I've been trained by all of these fucking movies to just expect, like, that random homeless person on the street, or like the mom holding their child's hand. Is the moment, like, you say Jonathan, like someone's gonna drop a pistol out of their bag and just immediately come again. So, like, in most action movies, I assume everyone is a hitman until they aren't, you know? So, like, I never questioned that. I've seen much weirder Hitman. She could just fucking drip him to death. She was wearing a cool outfit, so you know, fuck it, right?
I don't know. Like she was the one where I'm like, okay, she's talking for a really long time. She's got to do something. She's got to have some move that she's building toward. And it was, oh, she was gonna try to knife him. Like, really? You suck, lady. It was just me though. I don't know.
No, that was that was also just one of those things where it was like the it goes to Steve's thing of like it's just like I don't know because you made a good point, Steve. Right? Like it's for the people who like idolize Rorschach and like I already saw on YouTube when I typed in like the killer. There's a thumbnail. It's like the most Sigma movie of all time. The thumbnail is like he's literally me, and I was like, oh no. but I also when I do have something that is trying to be this methodical, my brain always like no matter what I always have to go to a characterization standpoint, right? And you say like I'm not meant to feel sympathy for a character like this. I kind of inherently argue that premise. I think the moment you put a character on film, you are making the audience feel sympathy for them because that's just what film is as a medium. It's about building a bridge, and it's kind of I think it's almost foolish to try and stop that. I think that's just kind of a losing battle. Like the moment you put anyone's shoes, especially if they're the main focus, right? The audience is always just going to gravitate towards that. And this film uses that because there are multiple instances where it's like, oh, is he going to ever like have some mercy, or is he ever going to have like a sense of like calm and stuff? And like he does have, he does do the fucking the secretary woman who assists Hodges. He gives her the death she asked for, you know? So, like, was that just expediency? Was that, like, thing? They don't really linger on that. I appreciate that. You can kind of make your own views on that. But I think David Fincher might be thinking he's a little too edgy if he thinks that this movie about himself won't make people sympathize with him, because I think David Fincher's a cool dude. like I don't care if you're a little autistic and you get like really specific about details, man. I like your movies, like, so don't worry. So like, nah, I fight back on that extent, but not to the extent of like to idolize. But I just think like, of course you're gonna feel sympathy for a protagonist in a movie. That's just how movies work. But I do think as well the way he carries it through and the way he is kind of inherently ridiculous all goes to like Fassbender's performance. And like how did you guys feel about how he handled it as like carrying a lot of this movie's workload on his back with so much narration and stuff compared to his other roles? Or because it's a hard role to do because he's specifically being asked not to do much, but that's hard to, you know what I'm saying? Like that's like to do that well is harder than it sounds.
Yeah. I was interested in the beginning of this movie because, like, the very first thing that came to mind for me as I started watching this and knowing that Steve was, like, you know, kind of hedging his bets on what he was going to pick. He's like, oh, all right, I'm going to see if I've learned my lesson here. The very first thing I thought of, especially when it got to the yoga stretching scene, was like, oh, it's an American Psycho. It's one of these. And honestly, it is, though. It, like, 100% is an American Psycho style film. So I was kind of interested to see, like, where it goes and how they'd run with that. And the thing that I found, like, really fascinating is how much of this movie depends upon narration. And that's true, of course, in American Psycho as well. But I became obsessed with the film American Psycho at one point because, Alfie, I was one of those guys. Like, I didn't do YouTube at the time, but if I did, I would have been one of those guys. Patrick Bateman is literally me.
I think we've all been there at some point. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. So, like, but, like, I remember watching the director's commentary. Both directors did a commentary on American Psycho separately, and I watched both of these things. And I remember one of them made the point of like, we were really nervous about having any narration in our film because we feel that narration is the laziest move a screenwriter can do. And honestly, that no notes that has stuck with me for a long time. Anytime I hear narration in a movie, my first thought says, did this have to be narrated or are they being lazy? And what I tend to use as a metric for that is how good is the narration? Does it have like a level of prose to it? Does it like actually ring true? And this movie, I think, did end up clearing that bar. I was a little worried about it at first, but then it did end up clearing that bar because while he does have a lot of like really ridiculous lines, he does have some others that are like, if not like poetic, really well like phrased, really like good point, and just kind of hit. The comparison that like kind of came to mind for me was it's got a little bit of like that Frank Miller narration feel, like where it just a couple lines here and there have like just that right kind of hit to them. And of course I say that and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I just remember like in the moment watching it, I was like, okay, yeah, no, that was a good one. Yeah, that one was pretty good. Some of them like a little less so, like the billionaire wanted Postmates. I'm like, okay, that just feels lazy. Um,
He's got to add to your point, he's got some fun lines where I feel like he's kind of threading the needle between saying something ridiculous that's actually also really funny, but also feels like something Frank Miller would write. Like I've got one line that I wrote down from the early parts of the movie where he's like still walking around Paris, and he says, "My camo is based on a German tourist I saw in London a while back." No one really wants to interact with a German tourist. Parisians avoid them like the rest of the world avoids street mimes. I just think that's so funny.
yeah, yeah. Stuff like that was good. I love the. I do want to talk more positively about this film for a little bit, so I want to just go through some stuff that like hit well for me. I love the level of paranoia that he has as he's going back home. Just like everything from when he leaves the scene of the shooting till he gets back to the house and all of his worst fears come together. Particularly the like just super tense thing for me was the room service scene. When he gets the thing from room service and you're like, okay. And then he like sets up the little booby trap to alert him in case anyone tries to come into the room. And then he's just like sleeping there with a knife next to him. I was like, oh man, that's like that was like legitimately tense. That was legitimately cool ass setup for a scene. I really like that. Cool.
No, I didn't realize it was muted for a second there.
Alfie,
No, I go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna agree with Ian. Like I liked a lot of that as well. I thought that was really well done. I think there's a lot of really good. There's a lot of eye work in this, which I think is really, really, really good. Narration and eye work, as shown by the Batman, is an easy way for me to like your movie. So like, it's just a lot of like close-ups of just like his expressions and kind of like darting back and forth, and that's when the narration isn't needed. So I think that kind of goes to your point, Ian, of like he's showing that he can do that without needing it to be narrated, and then when he does narrate it, it kind of gives him a pass. It's kind of like you want to establish you can do it without the crux, the cheats, and then you're allowed to use the cheats. You have to like earn them, and I think it does a good job with that. So I just want to say I agreed with Ian on that. What was your question, Steve?
I was going to say that to answer your question from earlier, I think Michael Fassbender does a really good job in this movie. I think he is able to kind of get us into the killer's head while still maintaining that sort of level of distance that's required to make this work. Because to your point earlier, you're right. The second he starts talking and the camera is from his perspective, you do sort of inherently sympathize with him. But the trick of the movie that makes it work is that it's always going against your inclinations or the things that you are most likely to do. You want to sympathize with this guy, but he never like really gives you a reason to. It goes out of its way to take advantage of the fact that you can relate to or understand or think he's cool, because every time you get that feeling, he immediately says something or does something extremely fucked up or stupid. And I think Fassbender playing off so much of the ridiculousness in a deadpan, cold kind of way is kind of fantastic. Fassbender's a great dramatic actor, obviously. I mean, his version of Macbeth from a couple years ago is fantastic. He's done a lot of good work, but he's always kind of picked shitty franchise projects, getting roped into endless bad X-Men sequels. But he's a very good dramatic actor, and I think something that everybody learned this year between this movie and Barbie is that you get actors like Ryan Gosling and Michael Fassbender, people who do movies like Drive, and suddenly you realize, oh shit, they're actually really good comedic actors too. They have great senses of comic timing. They're really good physical actors, and I kind of love the idea that Fassbender is essentially just playing Ryan Gosling's part from Drive in this movie, except he's making it as funny as possible without sort of breaking the bit. And I think it does take a special kind of talent to kind of make that work without ever sort of like winking at the camera. But he pulls it off really, really well, and I love him in the movie, especially because he has to carry basically the entire 2 hours by himself. Like, there are recurring characters, or not even recurring, but there are characters that have more scenes than others. Like Tilda Swinton gets a little bit more to do. The client at the end is on camera for a little bit longer than most other people. But aside from those two, whose collective runtime you could chalk up to like maybe 10 or 15 minutes, the whole rest of the movie is just Michael Fassbender the entire time. And I think he handles that pressure really well, especially knowing how demanding and how methodical David Fincher's process is, and knowing that you are basically going to be on set every single day for every single shot, and knowing what that sort of entails given this guy's methodology.
Fun extra note on Fassbender's role in this is I've never had this with him before, but for some reason, just in this film, I don't know if it's just the makeup or how he's aged or how he's lit, is he looks a lot like my dad. like when I was watching it, it was just kind of like really surreal because there'll just be certain expressions and stuff where like he's like a dead ringer for my dad, and I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, so that was an added layer to the whole thing. Is just like, father, like, why are you doing this? You're not nearly this competent. So, like, but then he fucks something up, and I was like, oh, there you go, never mind, he's fine. But no, that was a very weird experience. I've never had that in a movie before.
I had that a while back when we reviewed Noah, and then one of the sons. I'm just like, it's fucking Alfie. I swear to God, what the fuck's Alfie doing in this movie?
I remember that.
Another thing I did want to talk about is like we can maybe sidestep some of the issues as far as like whether or not you thought the movie was funny or whether or not you were sort of engaged with what the movie was trying to go for, and talk a little bit more about just how well made the whole movie is, how gorgeous it looks, how tightly edited it is, how methodical the process for this was. Because David Fincher is such a like controlling director, he basically never in his whole career really uses handheld camera work because he doesn't like the way that ends up turning out on film, and you can't control the movements and stuff as much. And this movie has a lot of scenes that have handheld camera work, particularly in that fight scene in Florida, a little bit after the halfway point. Only for a lot of people to praise it and be like, yeah, David Fincher doing handheld, that's really daring, that's really interesting. Only later to find out the cinematographer did an interview, and he's like, no, actually, we didn't do handheld at all in the movie. We shot all the scenes with stabilizers, and then in post-production, we selectively destabilized the frames to create the effect of handheld. And it's a really interesting choice to do it that way, because when you go into it with that context, you can kind of view it and see something is a little bit off about it. It's not nearly as smooth as like an actual handheld camera movement would be. And the fact that it's manufactured in that way, that you could have just done it this way, but you'd create this extra step and create this level of detachment from it that so perfectly symbolizes the methodology of the Killer 2, I really, really liked. And it's a strong argument for why things like special effects awards are not just about CGI, but about how much you can stretch the actual physical technology of a film that already exists. Because you look at some of the ways he came up with the shots and how they were captured in this movie, and when you realize how much of it comes from post-production, light work and like the destabilizing the stabilized shots, you realize how VFX heavy this movie actually is, and you would never know it without looking at the behind the scenes stuff. And like that level of confidence, I think, or competence, is a much different skill set than work shooting things with green screen that I feel like is an equal caliber.
Yeah. I guess I'd push back just a little bit on the beauty of the movie. I think most of it was just like kind of competent. I don't think there was like any shots or any moments that like really made me feel like wowed beyond the fight. And even then, I don't think the camera work during the fight was all that impressive or noteworthy. So I hate to keep going back to negatives, but like the cinematography on this was kind of just like baseline for me. I wasn't really impressed or like interested in any of the angles or any of the like shots they were choosing. Like in the beginning when he's in Paris and he's like going down the stairwell was kind of okay. It was a slightly interesting angle, but again, I feel like we've done that a billion times. Yeah, I don't know. Nothing. I don't think any of the camera work really impressed me all that much.
Just for more context, I mentioned it before, but I think the fight scene that he has at the end is hands down the best fight scene of any movie this year, which is saying something because a John Wick movie came out this year. I thought it looked incredible. I thought everything that he did with it was actually spectacular. And there are so many scenes in this movie where I feel like you could pause it on any given shot and just admire how well crafted the shot is or how good the blocking is. Early on, when you're looking at the hotel from his window, it's such a gorgeously composed scene. I don't know. I feel like it is. Maybe it's one of those things where it's like, it seems like it's really simple, but when you like stop and pause it and you realize like where things would have to go to make the shot exist, and you realize how much difficulty there is to it, and that's why it's so good.
Maybe. If we're talking like, the behind the camera stuff, I think the thing that impressed me most was the editing trick that they kept going back to, where you would just get these really abrupt cuts to establish time jumps, and that was the one that I think I found the most interesting, the most impressive, especially because they introduce it pretty early on. I think when he first tries to go to sleep while he's staking out the dude who wanted to get dommed. That poor bastard. Imagine the blue balls on that guy. But like there's that sequence where Michael Fassbender like is going to sleep, but his alarm's waking him up like every hour or whatever, so he can check the hotel. I think that was like when they first introduced these like really drastic cuts to establish time passing. And I liked that as a recurring device quite a bit.
The cinematography as well. I like Ian said, like how it was cut. It was good for me because I think there is a lot of craft in competence, and I wonder how much, especially with like a lot of movies, and like how poorly cutted lately they are. Like the art of editing just seems to be dead. I do really appreciate a film that is kind of playing it straight and not trying to do too many like crazy dolly shots or crazy camera moves, but just is presenting it in a way where if you're not looking at it, you can just kind of enjoy it for what it is. It's not distracting. But if you are looking at like set design and shot composition and layout and stuff, it is really good. I feel like that's almost something that it reminds me more of like a 2000s movie. Like it's something that we used to do a lot more then, where we weren't trying to be as flashy with it, but we were just being really competent at a very, very high level, which fits the movie because that's kind of what the movie's about, you know. So like, it'd be really embarrassing if like he made this entire film about this from like screenplay to casting, and then like the direction was like super choppy or shoddy, you know. Like it would just be like you don't cut the entire point. So the fact that it is so straight, the fact that it is just very, the color palette is nice and rich, but it's not like very saturated. It's still got a really kind of realistic thriller tone to it, but not in the sense of like nothing's like grayed out, but there's no like sweeping shots of like impressive locations and stuff. A lot of the locations we go to, we get a quick montage of sorts on a very street level, on a very POV level, but I think that's good as well because it sets the place, it sets how this guy views the world. So it wasn't one of my favorite aspects of the movie, but I did enjoy it a lot, and I don't have anything negative to say about it as well. But I think that's how I feel David Fincher in general. I think I prefer more so for what he gets out of his actors and what he gets out of his scripts versus what he puts in terms of like what's in a shot. I think those are more where I'm attracted to with what he has to offer. Whereas I'll go with some people who are a little bit more punchy. If I'm looking for a specific like scene composition and stuff. That's just his style, though. Like he's very good at it.
To your point, with acting, sometimes people will say that the performances that stick out are the ones where the person is doing the most acting as opposed to the ones where they're doing the best acting. And there is kind of a distinction between someone who's like really bombastic and transformative in a very overt way, as opposed to being able to like deal with those little emotional nuances that don't have the same sort of sympathetic camera. A lot of people criticized Joaquin Phoenix's Joker for that, where they said like people really loved it, but it's just because he's being really over the top, not necessarily because he's putting a lot of himself into the role necessarily. And that sort of becomes a common problem with a lot of like awards for best actor and shit. But with things like cinematography, I think there's a similar equivalent of like there's a difference between the most shot and something that is actually just very well shot. And so like you can have movies that have a lot of colors and a lot of big cuts and a lot of big cool locations and stuff, but you put that next to someone who is doing something very specific and very intentful, the way he uses lens distortions, the way he manufactures a way of doing handheld in an extremely controlled way, the way he's positioning the camera so you get like these really thrilling scenes without ever changing the language of the film to be like a Mission Impossible movie. Like you look at the bike chase, not the bike chase, but like when he's on a motorcycle in Paris and he's running away from the scene of the crime, you're never changing the way that scene is shot to get the most out of a motorcycle driving from one end of street to the other. You're instead focusing on all of those like tight personal angles, all of those street corners, and all of these like little things that help you understand the geography of what direction he's going in, but never in a way that sort of like aggrandizes the action itself, and without respect to what the emotion of the paranoia there that's supposed to be. And I think that's part of why it's such a beautifully shot movie, is it's not a flashy movie, but it's a movie that is deceptively in a genre that's known for being very flashy, and instead comes out very understated and does these things that are so subtle and efficient that on a technical level they're a lot more impressive than if you did them the other way. Part of what really works here is that David Fincher's whole methodology for the movie goes all the way down to that sort of microscopic level of what the movie is ultimately about. This is a movie about a character who says one thing and does the exact opposite. And the dissonance or the contradictions created by that are all over in the movie. Everything from not shooting an action scene like a traditional action scene, not shooting a chase scene like a traditional chase scene, not letting you make him feel like he's competent in any way, not using handheld camera and instead of finding some way to like overcomplicate or over-engineer it. The whole philosophy of the movie is executed all the way from how the story is structured, down to what it's about, down to all of the choices they make to film it itself. And I feel like that level of consistency and that level of having your fingerprint on every aspect of it is what separates like a director from just any old movie.
Oh, I think that was very well put, Steve. I think that's definitely the strength of it, and I don't think any of that was done bad at all. It's pretty good. It's pretty well done.
Yeah, it's just an alright movie. I'm sorry, Steve. I'm glad you like it as much as you do, but this is just one of those cases where I kinda felt like this was gonna be the vibe I had on this movie, where I went into it thinking, alright, we'll see what this is. I came out of it thinking, that was okay. Maybe I'll like it more once I talk about it with Steve, or maybe I'll think it was just okay, but I'll think that Steve is really smart and have a lot of points about this movie of stuff I didn't even pick up on, but still have no desire to go back to, and that's kind of where I'm at with this. You're thinking of like, oh, well, I think it's definitely one of those movies that improves on more watches, and I'm like, yeah, but I'm just not willing to give it to him. If in the ancient days of cable television, if this was on cable, I would skip to another thing. I don't think I would stop to watch it a second time. And I'm sorry, Steve. I'm glad you like it. I'm glad that there are people who make movies for Steves. The Steves of the world. The David Finchers of this world.
David Fincher, he knows what's up. He knows what's up.
I appreciate him for not making a movie, even with its intent to be kind of boring, that is so boring and so pretentious it's completely unwatchable. As far as like films go, this is not a film. What's that fucking one Rasco made us watch where Cameron Diaz fucks the windshield? That fucking movie still pisses me off to this day.
Jesus Christ.
That was a terrible fucking movie. Okay. I think I'm good. That and fucking Eraserhead. Eraserhead's one of the worst films ever made.
Damn.
It's so fucking bad. I don't give a shit. I feel like being as pretentious as Eraserhead deserves to just, like... If someone murdered David Lynch over Eraserhead, I would not shed a tear. I'd be like, well, I'm glad it wasn't me. Fucking piece of shit movie. Eraserhead and Come and See might be like the movies that would make me turn to crime.
Well, I will say, to kind of keep it on brand, I think this year had a lot of superhero and comic book movies. We had a new TMNT, we had a new Spider-Man, we had a new Guardians, we had the Marvels, and I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that The Killer is probably the best comic book movie of the year.
Get the fuck out.
It absolutely is. I don't know what you would put over it, honestly.
How the fuck can you not put Spider-Verse over this? Get the fuck out.
I like Spider-Verse. I thought it was very good, but it doesn't break my top 30, I don't think.
I question the validity of your list. Take that. Alright. Well, I've been listening to some Star Wars audiobooks recently, and so I had an idea of something I wanted to do a discussion on that's just going to be a really good title for a Geeky Gentleman episode. So hear me out on this. You ready? Okay, here we go. We're gonna discuss the Death Star. We're just gonna have a whole podcast discussing the Death Star. What that will entail, I don't know. But I just really want to talk about the Death Star for a fucking hour. So we're gonna do that next week.
Star approaching. Death Star approaching. Are we gonna do rankings?
If you want, I don't know how we're gonna fill the time, Alfie. But I'm debating if Star Killer base.
I meant for this movie.
For the film. My bad.
Okay,
I got really excited about talking about the Death Star.
Ranking
Like,
Death
I
Star
don't know.
1 or Death Star 2?
Death Star 1 or Death Star 2? Does Star Killer base count?
Yeah, I was gonna say. We're getting ahead of ourselves. That could be that's a topic for the next time.
Yep. All right. Yes, rankings on this film. Sorry. So I'm gonna give this literally 2.5 out of 5 dominatrixes. I was hoping that the dominatrix was supposed to be the one that he was supposed to kill.
That was a good outfit. That was good. That was good luck.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give it 4 out of 5 dogs blasting through windows at the speed of sound, because that was like the craziest shot I've ever seen of a dog blasting. Like, that thing was fucking moving.
I've seen doorbell cameras, man. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give it 5 out of 5 really hilarious bear sodomizing a man stories.
You don't really come here to hunt, do you? That's what I want. I want Tilda Swinton to tell really dirty jokes. That's the movie I want to watch.
It'd be a hit. It would be a hit.
Yeah. Alright, yep. So next time, the Death Star. I guess we'll debate on an episode if Star Killer base counts or not, because that sounds like a funny discussion. And yeah, so we're just going to talk about the Death Star. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
I am more powerful than you could possibly imagine.
And I am Patrick Bateman for real. That's just like me.
Oh God. That needs to be a Geeky Gentleman episode. Which toxic, horrible human being is like us the most?
Oh, that's a good one. All right.
That would be a really good one, yeah.
All right, and we are your Geeky Gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.